So much. Welcome to the War in the Humanities class. And class has been organized by Barbara Mennel, who is heading the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere. It's incredible to be able to understand war from a humanities perspective, and we have we've had access to so many great professors for this course. And today we're having Anastasia Ulanowicz speaking. She's an associate professor of English at the University of Florida, where she teaches and researches in the areas of children's literature, comics, memory studies, and historical fiction. She's currently writing a book on representations of Eastern Europe in Western comics. And she's also co-authoring with a colleague from Poland the first Anglophone introduction to Ukrainian children's literature. She'll be talking to us today about the war and children's literature. Professor.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just so impressed by this program and by the series, and it's just really a pleasure to be here. I'll say before, my students are constantly reminding me that I can talk really, really quickly, especially when I get excited. So if I just start jabbering, someone raise their hand and I'll slow down. I've tried to incorporate some text into the PowerPoint so that you can kind of follow along. Also, I have some books here that I'll be talking about. I'll have some of the illustrations on the screen, but I'll have them here and I might pass them around, or people are welcome to look at them afterwards. So I have a PowerPoint for you, and when I was invited to give this talk about the topic of war in children's literature, I considered it kind of a challenge because there's so much to say, and there are different kinds of avenues that I could begin by introducing this topic. And I could talk about, for example, the history of children's literature or representations of war in different cultures or in different periods of history. And what I ultimately decided to do is to talk about major themes of children's literature, but maybe give some specific concrete examples from Ukraine, either books that have been written recently in Ukraine during the war, the ongoing war, because it's really been going on since 2014, or from the diaspora. This is partly just because of my own research interests. I'm Ukrainian American, and I've been working on promoting and analyzing these books. And so I thought that since apparently this series on war and the humanities was in part inspired by people's curiosity about the war in Ukraine, that this might be a possible way to address this topic. So I'll begin by saying that in some ways we don't really associate children's literature with war. Usually when we think about children's literature, we tend to think about books like this. This is called Kto roste u parku, or Who Grows in the Park. It's a very popular book in Ukraine now by a popular illustrator and author. It's a story of a little seedling who grows in the park, and he wants to know what kind of tree he's going to grow up into. And so he talks to all of the trees in the park and he asks them, "Who are you? Maybe I'm like you." And they tell him about himself, and he doesn't find his own tree until the very end, and he realizes that he's going to grow up into being a ginkgo tree. The story is kind of a variation of Are You My Mother kind of story. It's a story about finding your identity, finding community, finding your own uniqueness and your acceptance by others. This is the kind of story that we expect from children's books. Also, this book, as you can see here, the pictures are whimsical, they're darling. There's something heartbreaking about books like this, because children's books like this, in some ways, offer children everything that we think is beautiful about the world. We give children books that makes them feel safe in the world, makes them feel at home in the world, makes them feel as though they're unique individuals. And this is really important. At the same time, however, we realize that even though we give children our ideals, our ideal community, the ideals don't necessarily look like children's everyday lives. And in fact, In the spring of 2022, the UN reported that nearly 2 billion people live in areas of major conflict that you can see here. Part of this map is gone, but you can see the shaded areas are all places where there is armed conflict that's currently existing. And those who are most profoundly affected or most profoundly vulnerable are children who are born into conflicts that they didn't start, that they weren't part of, that they don't understand. And 2 billion people is a quarter of the world's population. And even children who live outside of conflict or immediate areas of conflict are still affected by it. So children who are refugees, for example, children from Syria, children from Ukraine who are now living in other countries still have memories of war or have been separated from their parents and so are still affected by war in some way. Children whose adult guardians survived the war or whose grandparents perhaps might tell them stories about the war. When I was growing up, as a child, I was always curious by the fact that my grandmother was terrified of thunderstorms. And this is partly because she was such a brave woman, and it seemed just kind of illogical that she was just terrified by thunder. And it was only later on that I started to piece together that the thunder reminded her of bombs, and especially when Ukraine was being bombed by Germany. And so that children register, even when their parents or their elders don't tell them certain things, they realize that perhaps their parents or grandparents or adult guardians have been affected by something, and they kind of ruminate on these things. They're curious about them. Also, children might have parents or guardians who are military service people, whose parents might be deployed, who might be separated from their adult guardians, or perhaps whose adult guardians have experienced PTSD. And then also children are exposed to war through media, and they have been for quite some time, even when we think about, for example, newsreels and newspapers. I remember growing up in the 1970s, early 80s, and watching World News Tonight with Peter Jennings with my parents, and not understanding what Beirut was or Lebanon was, but knowing that something really terrifying was happening there. And I still had those kinds of images in my head, and I would ask questions about them. And, you know, for their sakes, they tried to explain as much as they could. But for children, even children who are way outside of war zones, war is a mystery, and it's something very, very scary. And sometimes adults don't want to talk about it to children, partly because they don't necessarily have the answers themselves, or it's difficult for us as adults to explain war to other adults. And especially it's difficult to talk about it to children at a level perhaps that they might understand, and also considering their own kind of fragile development, their psychological development. And so often what adults do is they tell children, don't worry about it, or it's going to be okay, or don't think about it. But the thing about children is they continue to think about it. And as with other topics that adults don't necessarily like to talk about with children, children are going to learn about it in one way or another. And so it's actually important that that war does become addressed in children's media, including children's literature. So for example, I don't know if anybody remembers in the early 1980s when there was I think it was a 3-part television special. It was a fictional film that was about all-out nuclear war called The Day After. And there was a lot of press and buzz that happened before this. And parents especially were very concerned about how children would react to watching this, because it was on broadcast television. It wasn't something that was kind of, reserved for theaters. And so Mr. Rogers created a special of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that was specifically about war and conflict, in which he used the neighborhood of make-believe and his puppets to talk about how conflicts start, and kind of gave a child-size allegory of the story of war to children. And one of the reasons he did this is because he believed that, first of all, that children are scared, children are worried, and they do want answers. And they need people to take them seriously and give them the kinds of answers and explanations that, on the one hand, don't belittle them, but on the other hand, that they can understand and grow with and grapple with. And so one of the things he said is, I want children to know that war is something we can talk about, whatever is mentionable is manageable. And so one of the things that children's authors have done and children's illustrators have done have mentioned the war in a way that's manageable by children. But before I give some examples of this, I want to do a little bit of background about children's literature and some kind of the principles of children's literature. So with very minor exceptions, and I'll get to some of the exceptions later, most children's books are produced by adults. They're produced by adults who are the authors, who are illustrators, they're editors, publishers, people who market and publicize books. That children's literature, even though we think of it as showing us the perspective of children themselves, are actually offering us the perspectives of their old adult creators, adults who perhaps remember their own childhoods, but that's always mediated through their own experiences as adults, and adults who present to children what they think that children should see or what they think that children should know. So one of the studies of children's literature, one of the things that scholars of children's literature take seriously when they examine children's books is whose perspective of childhood are being offered here, and perhaps also how are they mediated by the larger society in which adult producers of children's books live. So that, for example, books that were produced in capitalist societies, liberal societies that stress individualism, like the US or the UK, tend to offer individual heroes who kind of are plucky and kind of are very independent. You know, think Laura Ingalls Wilder or Alice from Alice in Wonderland. These characters that are kind of larger than life and very kind of like distinct individuals. In more collectivist societies, for example, China or the former USSR, the heroes aren't so much individuals as they are groups of children who often work together within collectives, because this is reflective of the society in which these authors are living. And also these authors are passing on the values from their own society to the future generations. Sometimes they don't even realize that they're doing this. They're not necessarily consciously trying to teach lessons of individualism or collectivism. It's because they're immersed in their own social situations, and they've so taken in these values that they pass them on to children as well. This is important to realize, of course, in representations of war to children, because what is being given to children through these books and other forms of media are reflections or representations of a larger kind of society. So the first kind of books that we think about as for children are picture books. And picture books are often written for the very youngest children who are just beginning to learn how to read, or not even just beginning to learn how to read, but who are just beginning to learn language. My sister had a baby about a year ago, and one of the things her pediatrician told her is to start reading to the baby as soon as possible, even when the baby was an infant, because it's important for infants to hear human language, to hear human voices. And picture books are often a good way to begin, so that, you know, the baby might not understand the words, but the baby starts taking in the melody of language. And then also very young children start seeing representations on paper. So picture books are the first ways in which children learn language and learn how to see visual cues. At the same time, even though picture books are for very young children, they're also really for adults. First of all, they were produced by adults, and also it's adults who go to the library or go to the bookstore, order books online, select what they think is appropriate for the child, what they think that the child might enjoy, what they think they actually might enjoy reading themselves, with the pictures that they think are especially aesthetically beautiful. And so they choose them, and then they perform them for children. So one of the delights of picture books, especially those that involve lots of rhyme and lots of verse, is that the adult gets to tell the story and act out the voices and the parts. Sometimes the adult will pause and ask the child questions about what's happening in the pictures or what's happening in the story, or they'll answer the questions that the child has. Sometimes they might actually make up little parts of the book that are actually in the verbal text itself. So really, picture books are intergenerational form. They demand some sort of correspondence or relationship between the child who's being read to and the adult who's reading to the child. And so that the child in turn will learn how to do this on their own later on. And some of the most greatest classical picture books are those that adults still enjoy reading. That I love the books of Maurice Sendak. I'm sure that you're familiar with Where the Wild Things Are and other books. And what I found about these books, in which my students as 21-year-olds really love as well, is that they grow with us. That when we were little kids, we read them, perhaps they meant something, but as we read them later on in life, perhaps even to our own children, we see things that we might not have noticed when we were children ourselves. We admire perhaps the artistry or little details we might not have noticed. We enjoy the turns of phrase. And so there's a pleasure that adults take in these texts as well. And then also it's one of the things we learn is that because the authors are adults, they were fitting in details perhaps from their own pasts, from their own unique selves that perhaps we might now notice. So that Maurice Sendak, as a child, was a very sickly child, and he was always afraid that he was going to die. He spent the first few years of his life in bed or in his room. He also was especially afraid of death because he was the child of Holocaust survivors, that many of his families in Europe were actually killed in concentration camps, and he learned this as a child. And so a lot of the images in his books that seem to be kind of innocuous refer to these early childhood fears of death, that in all of his books, there's at least one picture of the moon, because as a very young child, he would look outside to see the moon and the moon would console him. And so as long as he could see the moon, he would know that he was safe. There are other images, however, that are a little bit more scary that have to do with his own childhood fears of death. One of the final books that he wrote was Brundebar, which is based on a children's opera that was performed at the Theresienstadt concentration camp in what is now the Czech Republic. And all of the child performers who were in this camp were then later deported to Auschwitz. And so even though this book seems to be tell a very cheery story, the background to it is quite bleak. And it was Maurice Sendak's own way of processing his own thoughts about a traumatic historical past. So that even picture books that, again, seem to be very cheerful, sometimes also address trauma and war, but in ways that are manageable, in ways that people at different stages of development can perhaps understand. So that for the very young child, they might not necessarily know the background of Brundebar. For the adult, or even for the young person, the young adult, they might be able to piece these details together. So they kind of range according to age. So a question then becomes, how are adults telling the story of war now in Ukraine? And the first example I have is a book called How War Changed Rondo. This is produced by the husband and wife team, Andrei Lisieux and Romana Romashin. And they are from Lviv, which is in the western part of Ukraine. And together they form Studio Gravka. It's an art studio where they produce a lot of collage work, which is based on the one hand on very traditional kind of printmaking forms, and on the other hand on more contemporary digital graphic design. And they've already been very well known throughout Ukraine for their very intricate and kind of works of collage for children. Their books have won a lot of international awards. And then in 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, first of all, when they seized Crimea, and then warfare began in eastern Ukraine, the pair wanted to tell a story that they could tell to both children and adults about their own experiences of being surprised by war, their own way of working through what war meant to them and what their experiences of it were. And since that point, their book, as you can see here, has been translated into such languages as Korean and French and Polish and a number of other languages. And one of the reasons why it's been translated so widely is because it doesn't just tell the story of Ukrainian experiences of war, but of larger experiences of war itself. So the story is about these three little characters. One of them is this little light bulb called Danko. One of them is Fabian, who's a little balloon animal. And another one is Zirka, who's a little origami paper crane. Of course, this is the symbol of peace in Japan. And it's important that these characters aren't just anthropomorphic animals, they're anthropomorphic objects. They're not people, or they're not children with an actual ethnicity or race. They could be anyone. And these three little characters live in the magical town named Rondo, which is entirely fictional. It could exist anywhere. What we are told about Rondo is that it's full of plants and light and art and flowers and animals, and the people there are very happy. And in fact, for the first few pages of the book, I don't know how well you can see here, but you can tell from the illustrations here, they're full of color, they're full of life, and they're so full of detail that a child, or an adult for that matter, could spend a lot of time just looking at all the details and making connections amongst the different kinds of things. And these colorful pictures go on for quite some time, so we get used to the colors until finally this page happens. And you can't probably tell very well here, but on this 2-page spread, there are tanks and a big black mark on the left. And on the right, there's this insect creature that kind of looks like a helicopter on top. And below it are the words, "War is coming to Rondo." And the appearance of these purplish black colors are so sudden that I think every time I look at this book, I'm kind of taken aback because I'm so used to these very colorful images. And the authors did this on purpose to give the impression of what war feels like to people who are actually being invaded or living through it. That even if they expect war, even if they've seen warnings and notifications that tanks are mounting or that something's going to happen, when it actually happens, they're totally caught off guard. And one of the things that I've seen, not only in representations of Ukrainian experiences of war, but experiences of war throughout the world, that's the one impression that people have, is that it's just sudden and it takes you aback no matter how much you expect it. And so they use colors in order to create this kind of sense of surprise and the sense of trauma. What happens in the story is that Danko and his little friends band together and they create a light machine, and the light machine starts driving out the darkness of war. So there's some sort of happy ending here. There's some sort of hope that is intended especially for child readers who might be afraid or have questions about war. At the same time, not everything ends happily, so that we're told that each of the little characters is wounded in some way. The little light bulb Danko has cracks in him, and Zirka, the little paper bird, has singed wings, that her wings had been burned. And the final map of Rondo has lots of broken things inside of it, so that even though war ends and light has driven war out, nothing is ever going to be as it was. So the book gives a sense of hope, but at the same time, it gives a sense of realism, that it doesn't lie to the child, nor does it lie, for that matter, for the adult who has similar concerns as the child. It reminds the reader that things aren't going to be the same, that healing is going to be a process, but at the same time that it's possible. So this is one example of war. Again, this was an award-winning book. It's been translated into many languages, partly because it tries to address war in universal themes rather than just regional ones. Another example of picture books that address war and represent war is Yellow Butterfly. This is by Alexander Shatokin, and he was previously just an illustrator of children's books, so that he didn't necessarily write books himself. He just did illustrations and was commissioned to do illustrations for other people's books. However, during the full-out invasion in 2022, he was living in Sumy in northeastern Ukraine on the Russian border. And like everyone, he was just so overcome by what was happening that he decided that he would process his own experiences by creating a picture book of his own, but a picture book that's entirely wordless. So the story of this picture book is of a little child who remains nameless. She might look like a girl, but it could be a boy, it could be a girl. And so in that way, sort of the gender becomes universal as well, so that the child reader or the adult reader can empathize with her in any case. And in the very beginning, we see her surrounded by barbed wire, and as the pictures kind of zoom out like a movie camera, we see that the barbed wire is a giant web and that she's stuck in the web, and that this giant spider creature is creeping toward her. The spider creature here then becomes this allegorical figure of war, something that she can't escape. And yet, even as she is about to be taken in by the spider, and it's actually, quite scary imagery, it's really kind of nightmarish, she sees a yellow butterfly who's able to lead her out of the web. And as she follows the yellow butterfly, the butterfly takes her to different places that are familiar to her. And each of these places are places that have been hit by war in some way. So if you can see here, a park where there are just piles of old cars that have been bombed out. Another very striking image is of a playground with a rocket that's been hit right in the middle of the playground, that's actually taken from an actual photograph of an unexploded shell in a children's playground in eastern Ukraine. And she also goes to old apartment buildings that have been bombed. And as she passes each of these scenes of war, as the butterfly leads her, they start transforming, so that you can see in this, this final image, she's jumping over each of the cars, and she's being followed not just by one butterfly, but more butterflies. And as they go, this black and white, these gray images turn to color. As you can see here, the predominant colors are blue and yellow, so they evoke the Ukrainian national flag. They give a sense of hope to people in Ukraine. At the same time, the images of war, for example, of the playgrounds or the buildings, could as well be in Syria or Afghanistan or in other places that have been hit by war. The story, like How War Changed Rondo, gives a sense of hope, especially to child readers. However, since it's a wordless picture book, people can kind of tell the story according to their own needs, or they can see details according to their own experiences. So if an adult is reading this book, telling the story of the illustrations to the child, they might focus on the details of hope, of transformation. However, if an adult is looking at this themselves and perhaps recognizing some of the illusions of the book, or recognizing how the images compare to other images of war that they've seen, they might see it more realistically as our desire for hope at a moment when things are still quite bleak. I think also it might be interesting to compare how, let's say, Ukrainians and Americans living here might look at this book differently, so that someone in Ukraine who's actually seen these scenes, or someone else in another war zone who's seen scenes like this, might pay attention to the details differently than someone who's living in, let's say, the US. That when I was reading this book, even though I have family in Ukraine, I started just thinking about what are the scenes that are familiar to me, either here in Gainesville or in Baltimore, where I'm from, and what would they look like if they were attacked in the same way. And so it allows for different kinds of negotiations or strategies of reading, depending on who you are. And I think this is one of the gifts that picture books give us, is they allow us these opportunities for interpretation. So Picture books are written for children with the expectation that adults will read them to them. And eventually children are given the opportunity and in fact encouraged to read on their own. And they often begin with middle grade chapter books, that is novels that are divided into chapters that are designed for independent reading, for newly independent reading. Because these books are being written for children without their parents or their guardians kind of a presence, it's important that the adult is then incorporated inside of the book, that the adult voice, the guiding voice, the reassuring voice is present in the book so that children still have that kind of assurance or that security. It's also important that these books be as historically accurate as possible. To the point where if they're addressing or representing war, they have to address very difficult and sometimes graphic details that are unpleasant. At the same time, they have to do so in a way that is appropriate to the child's development, to the development of, let's say, a 10-year-old child or even a 12-year-old child, what they psychologically need, what they ethically need as well. So these books, even though they depict very disturbing images or scenes, have to create a clear distinction between good and evil, because children are still developing an ethical sensibility, of a sensibility of right and wrong. And therefore that has to be present in a book like this that speaks to that kind of development of the child. Until 2014, most Ukrainian books for children didn't address war at all. This was partly because before the collapse of the Soviet Union, they did a lot, but they did from a Soviet perspective, from a Russian perspective. Most of the books were about World War II or the Great Patriotic War, and it is very true that more than any other group in the world, the Soviets were most affected by the Second World War, at least on the European theater, that they bore the brunt of the losses and the deaths of the war and experienced incredible trauma and ultimately triumphed over Nazi invasion. And so the Second World War was celebrated in Soviet books, as it should have been. At the same time, a lot of aspects of World War II society was excluded, so that, for example, Stalin was often portrayed as a hero rather than a totalitarian dictator, and that Stalin's crimes against humanity, including the Red Terror or the famine, were not only repressed but punishable. And so a lot of Soviet books really downplayed aspects of Ukrainian experiences, of Soviet experiences. And after independence, Ukrainians were still grappling with the costs of this war, the cost of both Nazi invasion, but also Soviet occupation. They were still grappling with the role that Ukrainians played in the Holocaust. They were still grappling with how people collaborated with both the Soviets and the Germans. And so it was decided kind of tacitly that children's literature still wasn't ready to portray war, that there was still a lot of work to be done on the part of adults themselves in thinking about history and reconciling with history. This began to change in 2014, of course, when the war began in Ukraine and the representation of war in some ways became unavoidable. The most direct representations of war in Ukraine were about that present war. It's only now that the earlier wars, the Second World War, is actually being addressed. And I don't really know about other wars like the Afghanistan War, because a lot of people were in the Soviet army at that time. So for that reason, most of the books about the Second World War that depicted Ukraine were written within North America and parts of diaspora. And a lot of these books, especially recent ones, are challenging both Western and Soviet myths about the Second World War. They show the complicity of people in Ukraine with both of the totalitarian regimes, but then they also show how people tried to resist these regimes. In this way, they're addressing what Timothy Snyder has called the region of Eastern Europe that's now called the Bloodlands. Those part of Europe that was caught between Hitler and Stalin, where the borders kept on changing and allegiances kept on changing. And history was much more complicated than a simple good guy and a bad guy. And so these books are trying to address this, but for readers who are perhaps in middle school and early high school. One of the most well-known writers of World War II fiction that is set in Ukraine is Marsha Forchuk-Skrypuk, who's from Toronto. She's of Ukrainian heritage, and she's written not only about war in Ukraine, but also the Vietnamese War, Cambodia, Armenia, and she's really kind of dedicated her life to depicting perhaps the difficulties, the ethical complicated details of war, but to young audiences. She's very involved in visiting classrooms, both in Canada, but also virtually in the United States. Her books are now beginning to be translated into Ukrainian. So one of the first book of hers to be translated into Ukrainian is Stolen Child. It's about Ukrainian children in Ukraine who were essentially kidnapped by the Germans. Those of them who looked Aryan were taken from their families and placed into German homes in order to build Aryan humanity. Those who didn't look Aryan were used as slave labor. One of the reasons why this story really resonates with contemporary Ukrainians is now at this point, children in Eastern Ukraine are actually being taken from their families and being quote unquote rehomed in Russia and being raised as Russian children, so that this situation of children being stolen is not only something that happened in the 1940s or 1930s, but is continuing today and is of concern. And so in some ways, looking back to experiences of the past allow people to think about and discuss what's happening in the present time. One of Skrypuk's books that has become very popular among young children is called Don't Tell the Enemy. It's been republished as Don't Tell the Nazis in the United States. And like other middle grade books, it's important that this book has a sympathetic protagonist that the reader can identify with and who represents those kinds of values of the ethical good that the book or the adults want children to internalize. So this book is based on a real actual child named Hrestia, who along with her mother, who were later called Righteous Among Nations. In the course of the book, Hrestia is working in a village that is occupied by the Germans, and she and her mother are employed as maids in the commandant's home. And because they're just servants and they're kind of sneaking around in the background and nobody pays them mind, and also everybody thinks that they're stupid because they're subhuman, they take advantage and start spying on what the commandant and his wife are talking about, and they relay this to the partisans and and the Ukrainian resistance, and they also take in friends of theirs who are Jewish who have been blacklisted by the Nazis. This allows Skrypuk to show, for example, the German occupation in Ukraine, also the complicity of Ukrainian Gentiles in supporting Germans. At the same time, she gives us a very strong character who represents, ethical convictions that it wants the child to emulate. Another way that this book, I think, is unique is that it shows the similarities between Soviet occupation and German occupation. So in the beginning of the book, the village is occupied by the Soviets, and many members of Hrestia's family have been shot by the Soviets or have been imprisoned and tortured. After the Soviets are driven out by the Germans, the Ukrainians are relieved and they welcome the Germans as their liberators because the Germans promise them that they're going to have their own nation. And then what happens is that the Germans start shooting and imprisoning the Ukrainians as much as the Soviets did. Although, as Hrestia notes, the people who are most vulnerable are the Jewish citizens of the town. And so here, it's not as though the Soviets are the good guys and the Germans are the bad guys. Both totalitarian regimes are problematic in different kinds of ways. And what we see here is Hristia's attempt to work between them, to resist both of them. And also in this way, it gives us a sense of what life in the Bloodlands was, where there was no easy side to take, depending on where you were. After middle grade readers, sort of the next step of children's literature is young adult books. And recently, young adult books have become increasingly popular, I think especially perhaps in the last 20 years, maybe beginning with the later Harry Potter books, definitely with the Hunger Games books. These books are read not only by, let's say, teenagers, but by new adults, that is, college students, even post-university young people. Most of my students read young adult literature, even though they're 21, 22, just for fun. And so their popularity is much enjoyed. And these young adult books are written for young people whose perhaps psychological development and ethical development is now a little bit more advanced. Young people who have now grasped differences between right and wrong, and now are prepared perhaps to address or understand the gray areas between right and wrong, or ethical nuances, the complicated, complex, not easy answers that people have, and also who have a sense of their own ethical and political beliefs, but at the same time might be open to having those challenged and therefore perhaps strengthened. Ukrainian YA novels really didn't exist until very recently. Most YA novels that were published in Ukraine were originally written in English or Polish or Russian or German and then translated into Ukraine. It's only recently that they've been originally written in Ukrainian itself. Again, those that have addressed war were very few and far between until 2014 when it became kind of inevitable. And the first YA book that addresses war was Yirko Mentsanyuk's How I Ruined the Empire, which is about a girl living at the end of the Soviet Union, at the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the meantime, however, YA books that are written in diaspora, and especially in North America, that address the Second World War and earlier wars in the Soviet Union and Ukraine have now begun being translated. One of these books is Traitor by Amanda Makrina. As you can guess from her first name or last name, Amanda Makrina isn't Ukrainian. However, she very carefully researched Eastern European history, Russian history, Ukrainian history, Polish history, and learned the languages. She also consulted a number of scholars from these countries, including my co-author in our Introduction to Ukrainian Children's Literature. So she's very well adept at looking at the complications of this history. And if Skripal's books for middle grade readers started to address ethical questions, a YA book like this complicates them even further, so that not only does Makrina address the tension between, or the Soviet Empire and the Nazi Empire, but at the same time she addresses the other conflicts that are happening. So for example, both the Ukrainians and the Poles, and there are lots of Poles living in Western Ukraine at this time, were in resistance, living in the woods, fighting against both the Nazis and the Soviets, whoever presented themselves at the time. The problem is that the Poles and the Ukrainians had a bitter history, and so they were also busy fighting each other. So depending on whether you were a Pole or Ukrainian, you might be a part of a resistance, but at the same time, you could be shot or tortured by the other side. And then both the Poles and the Ukrainians were complicit in the persecution of Jews. And so the whole history was messy, it was entangled, and it was therefore very difficult for people to find a position in a resistance that would be as humane and ethical as possible. In order to address this, Makrina gives us a protagonist, Tolia, who's called a half-breed. His mother is Polish and his father is Ukrainian. This gives him and also the readers the benefit of seeing both the perspectives of the Poles and the Ukrainians and of kind of like fitting in with both. But at the same time, it makes him always in danger because even perhaps his accent when he speaks one language might give him away that he's not completely an ethical whole, especially in this period of ethnic cleansing. Unlike the protagonists of middle grade novels, moreover, Tolya he isn't entirely innocent and entirely righteous. He has to make difficult decisions that compromise his own values, that compromise the people that he loves. The book introduces the claim that we are all in some ways implicated subjects, that none of us are ever completely innocent bystanders, but by growing up within a particular society, even now, we are complicit. For example, that even now by paying our taxes, we don't know exactly where our money comes from, where it goes, and how we might be complicit in larger structural kinds of injustices. And so a book like this for young adult readers begins to address that question of implication, and invites readers to think about concepts like innocence and guilt. And also it gives us a further kind of sturdier picture of what the Bloodlands looked like in the Second World War and why that history is so important to understanding the current war that's happening in the Ukraine. For example, why Russians continue to call Ukrainians Nazis, or why, for example, it's so significant that Poles have taken in Ukrainians with such welcome. And this is something that's really underappreciated, I think. I think every Polish person I know has had at least one Ukrainian living in their house with them for the past year or two. And Poles have opened up their homes in a way that's truly surprising because 80 years ago, they were butchering each other. I think it's also really stupendous that people in Israel have been so supportive of Ukraine, even though that history is really bloody as well. And so I think that also these books show the traumas of the past in order to show perhaps future possibilities of reconciliation that can only be come to by a revelation of, an honest recognition of the truth of war and the complications of war. So finally, I said in the beginning of the lecture, I'm nearly the end, that most children's books about war, most children's books at all, are not written by children themselves. One of the few exceptions are children's books that are diaries, and especially children's war diaries. These constitute only about 1% of all books for children ever written. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl. Also Zlata Filipovich's book, Zlata's Diary, really made waves during the early 1990s. I was a teenager when this book came out, and it really profoundly affected me in my understanding of what was happening during the siege of Sarajevo. Nadia Halilbegovich's book, My Child Under Fire, is a really interesting book because Nadia was a child during the siege of Sarajevo and kept a diary. And then she ultimately came to Canada. And as an adult, she went back to her diary and she started making annotations and notes and filling in the details that she wasn't able to address when she first wrote the diary. So we see kind of a conversation there between her childhood self and her adult self. And then later, Zlata Filipovich above, who's become a major advocate for world peace, edited a collection of children's books, children's diaries from the First World War to the war in Iraq, which gives us a sense of the variety of different kinds of voices and experiences of war. Diaries are really important, I think, not only for children to read, but also adults to read. First of all, because they involve a first-person narrator. They involve an I that we can sympathize with and identify with, and so we kind of follow the narrator as our guide in the daily experiences of war. Also, at the same time, they often address a reader, so that, for example, in the Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank names her diary Kitty, and she begins each entry saying, "Dear Kitty," and sometimes she refers to Kitty and says, "You might be thinking this, or you might be wondering this." And so she sets up the reader as an interlocutor, and she becomes their guide, so that the reader also, even as they're identifying with her, recognizes themselves as an outsider who needs to be educated or needs to be brought in. The same thing happens with Zlata's diary. She names her diary Mimi, and so we become kind of the following this guide through her experiences of Sarajevo. And so here we really have children's perspectives in ways that we don't necessarily have in books that are written by adults. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that still these books are being published by adults. The adults have selected these diaries, that they've edited them, they've published them, etc. One of the first diaries to emerge from the Ukrainian war is You Don't Know What War Is, by Yeva Skalitska. And Yeva, it was a little girl, I think she was about 12, yes, she was 12 years old when the war first began, the full-out war first began. She was in Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine, which was one of the cities that was most brutally attacked in the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. She was already a talented writer and artist when she began the diary, when the war began. And so she drew on her talents in order just to start writing everything that happened to her, really as a coping mechanism more than anything else. That when the war began, she, like everyone else, was just so overwhelmed that writing about her experiences became therapeutic. Like other children's war diaries, this one begins before the war, and she actually kind of predates her diary. So to set up what's happening, she talks about how on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day was her birthday. And so she had a big birthday party and all of her friends were there. And she kind of gives us a portrait of everyday life in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, before the war. She knows, like other Ukrainians do, that there are threats of war, but at the same time, they don't know what to expect. And therefore, she starts introducing what happens on each day after the war begins and walks us through her experiences, first of being in Kharkiv with her grandmother, and then she and her grandmother moved to one of her grandmother's friends' homes in another place. Then they go down south to Dnipro, then they take a train to Lviv, then another train to the Hungarian border, and then finally to Ireland, and all of this within 2 weeks. And so this child is kind of taking in all of these things at once, and one of the ways that she processes all of these experiences that are happening so subtly is by writing about them. One of the things that's really interesting about this diary too is that at the end, she's asked her friends, many of them who are still in Ukraine, to write about their first impressions of war and what they've been doing since. So we have kind of a postscript and a follow-up. And each of them describe the first time they registered that the war was happening in different ways, but each of them show how surprised they were. So Yeva herself says that at 5 o'clock in the morning, when the city started being bombed, she thought that there was like a big crane or like shovel in the street that was kind of breaking into the earth and scraping the earth. You know, when you're like just waking up for a dream and you hear things that are happening and you kind of imagine scenarios. And so it didn't register with her that there were bombs. She just thought something was scraping the road. And another one of her friends thought that there was a car accident, like a huge crash in the back. Every person had a different kind of impression by being woken up by the war and surprised by the bombings. And that impression became that first moment where normal became not normal, or where the experience of war became the new normal. And I think it's really interesting, you know, how that happens. It's sort of, again, like this moment in War Change Rondo when we're taken by surprise, and it gives us the impression of what it must be to be taken by surprise. That Yeva says in the end, you might imagine what war is, but you'll never know what it's like until you've actually been there. And, you know, and I think that not just civilians, but, you know, friends of mine who've been in the military say the same thing, that they say the people that you think are going to, you know, kind of buck up and be really strong, break down. The people that you think that you're kind of worried about sometimes are the bravest and the most resilient, and that war really tests who we know of ourselves and other people. And I think it's interesting that this child who's 12 years old recognizes this as well. As important as it is, however, to study children's diaries, especially because they give us children's perspectives, it's also important to recognize, first of all, that they're mediated. That Anne Frank's book, for example, was found much later. Her father, when it was first published, her father edited out a lot of parts that he thought perhaps were appropriate or that perhaps would show the family in a bad light. It's also been challenged, like a lot of other books have been, by censors. Also, that Zlata's diary in some ways was mediated because she submitted this book to a writing competition. She knew that people would be reading it. It wasn't just her private diary. She intended it as a diary to be read by a larger public. And so she already kind of set herself up as kind of a more adult figure. Even Yeva's book is really exceptional because one of the reasons this book became published was Yeva was, I think she was in Lviv at this time, and she was in this big refugee center. And there was an Irish news team that was interviewing refugees, and they were looking for English speakers. And she excelled in English, so her mother pushed her forward. And the interviewers found out that she was keeping this diary and asked to read it. And they ended up profiling her for this Irish TV show. And because they became so invested in her and her safety, they were actually able to have her papers processed so that she could move to Ireland. They set her and her grandmother up in a home, and they finally got an apartment of their own. Really, this is an exceptional kind of circumstance. Most children don't have this experience, or most adults don't have this experience. So what we read and what we're represented for us is only half the picture. I think also it's really important to recognize that even though Anne Frank's diary has been known as a Holocaust diary, it would have been impossible for her to actually represent the concentration camp itself. Even if she had wanted to, even if she had had access to paper and pencil, I think that her experiences would have been so overwhelming that it would have been impossible to try to depict them and represent them. So much is missing from these books. There are lots of holes, for example, in Zlata's diary or My Child Under Hood, High Under Fire, where the children are just so traumatized that they say, I can't write anymore. Or they write things in all caps saying, I'm done for the day, I can't. So we have to kind of read these books between the lines and also think about how they were processed and mediated, and how what is not said is as important in these books as what is said. And then also, I think it's also important to recognize that these diaries are the diaries of children who, for the most part, unfortunately not in the part of Anne Frank, were able to survive. So many children didn't. You might be familiar with this image. This is from March of 2022 in Mariupol, where children were being rescued and placed in a theater for safekeeping. And the caretakers of the children wrote "Yete" or children in Russian, so that the Russian bombers would see that there were children here and spare the children. And the entire theater was bombed anyway, which gives us a sense of how much the Russians have actually targeted civilian populations and the most vulnerable people amongst the civilian populations. And those children's voices won't be heard. There are so many refugees like Yeva whose voices won't be heard as well. And I think it's important to keep those silences in mind, that for every Yeva, there's children whose stories we won't hear. But since there are stories that we won't hear, it's important that children's books authors continue to write about them, continue to address them according to different angles, according to the ages of their audiences and what is most appropriate for those audiences at the time, that they give children and also the adults who are buying these books for children or taking them from the library or reading them with children, as many different kinds of perspectives as possible. Not just about, obviously, the Ukrainian war, but about war in general and those voices that we really need to hear. So thank you very much.
And thank you. We're open for questions, both online and here in Okemik.
Thank you for that very nice talk. When you were referring to that butterfly book, I was reminded of a poem that was written by a child about I will never see another butterfly.
Yeah.
And so a lot of poetry and drawing that was done, which is not the same as novels, but about yearning and, you know, the confrontation was war from a different angle. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up because I think I'm not sure how much the author intended to reference that poem, but I suspect he did because it's very well known. And there's an entire collection of children's art that was produced during the Holocaust that's called I Will Never See a Butterfly. A lot of it includes art made by children in Theresienstadt, the camp where the opera was performed. And probably the author was familiar with this. And so even though this is being produced by an adult, there's a certain kind of homage to the experiences of children who witnessed war, some of whom survived, most of whom didn't, and a recognition that, you know, in some ways, history repeats itself differently at every point, but you know there are consequences that are similar. I think also the War Changed Rondo draws a lot on folk art, also children's art, even as it's also kind of drawing on aspects of modern art as well, and kind of placing them against each other in this kind of collage, in a way that speaks not only to child and adult audiences, but also to child and adult artists, including witnesses of war.
Thank you. I really enjoy this. I love reading more, anything about any of the wars. But I wonder if you would be kind enough to send your slides to Julianne, so that we might have a bibliography and would be able to read some of these books.
Of course, of course. And
Thank
I can
you.
actually write up a bibliography in addition to just
Wonderful.
The slides.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Other comments?
Anne Marie, do you have a question?
Well, okay. I didn't raise my hand, but yeah, I would like to know if any of the books come with any kind of companion piece for parents or teachers, educators, to try to parse through what the value of the books is and try to draw it out, because I can see many people wanting to make sure that the child is prepared to see the book for what it's worth, and to get the most out of it without any kind of worry about triggers or traumatizing the child.
Sure, yes. Yellow Butterfly does, and in some ways it is such a useful book because it is a wordless book that adults can kind of fill in their own verbal text according to what they think is most suitable, but it has some back matter at the end. One of the pages is titled Sharing a Wordless Picture Book, and it gives some suggestions on how adults might share this book with the child readers, and then guiding the conversation on the other page that gives a little bit more background about the war, and not just this war, but about war, the topic of war in general, and how adults, not just parents, but also perhaps librarians and teachers, might introduce certain kind of topics that are sensitive to the needs and, as you say, don't trigger children. Another book that I didn't include here that perhaps I could include in a bibliography is called Maya and Her Friends, and it was written after 2014, and it's basically about a girl's classmates in her, I think it's her grade 5 class. And each of them comes from a different household, a different family. Some of them, you know, there's Maya has 2 mothers, and then another boy has who lives with his mother and his stepfather, and has a mother who's living in Australia. Each of them has different family backgrounds, but one of the children is a refugee from Crimea. Another one is a refugee from Kharkiv, and in these pages, there's supplementary material that gives background about these conflicts, and then also there's back matter that gives some suggestions about how adults might share the book. Not only in its address of questions like war, but also because it addresses the experience of children who are orphans, not necessarily because of the war, or children who were conceived by IVF, or all these other kinds of matters that the book is representing of a modern Ukrainian classroom.
In the book about, excuse me, about Rondo. Okay, you want it further? Okay. At the end, the light from the city, the creatures light up and drive away the darkness of war. That's a magical or spiritual resolution. How is a parent going to tell a kid how that works?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I think it depends on the parent and their own interpretation. That because this is an allegorical book, and because it leaves room for kind of the parent to be sort of the chaperone who makes commentary, depending on their background, their beliefs, their interpretation, they can interpret that light machine in different ways. So that these three little characters create a light machine that dispels war. The parent or the guardian can talk about resilience. They might ask the child themselves, "What do you think the light machine represents? You know, why do you think it's important that they create a machine that makes light? Why is war represented as dark?" And so that this might be an opportunity to actually involve the child in their own interpretations, and then to guide the conversation according to how the child responds. I would imagine also that this would be read, for example, by a teacher or a librarian to groups of children that perhaps might invite conversation amongst children themselves. I just read actually an article about a Swedish classroom where they were reading a book, I think about a Syrian refugee, because there are lots of refugees coming to Sweden now as well. And the leaders open up the conversation to children, and children are really adept at reading different symbols and imagining different kinds of interpretations, and also being sympathetic with the characters in ways that really kind of surprised the adults with their maturity.
Other comments or questions? I had a question. Could you address the role of children's war literature in the publishing industry? What gets published, what doesn't?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it probably follows the market and what is at people's attention. I noticed that Yeva's book, she started keeping her diary the first 2 weeks of 2022. I believe I found this book at Barnes & Noble in the fall of 2022, so the turnaround was really, really quickly. I'm not sure whether a book like that would be as marketable now, where there's some degree of exhaustion and people are kind of moving to the other thing. I think also children's books about war are published and circulated based on how perhaps readers, educators see how they're addressing their audiences. There's some children's books about war that I wouldn't read to children. I think they're more for adults. There's one just absolutely heartbreaking one I read a couple of years ago about zoo animals in wartime Japan during the Second World War, where the animals started starving and the zookeepers had to shoot them. And I could barely get through that book myself. I would never, ever read that to a child. And so I think this also raises the question of, who the audiences are, and perhaps why picture books don't necessarily need to be marketed just to children, and how they might speak to different kinds of audiences, including adults. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you for these wonderful questions. I'll be sure to send a bibliography in my slides. And again, thank you for having me. This has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, and don't forget the books that are up there. Take a look at them.
Oh, yeah, and I have these books here.